Disorders of bone resorption. So the first one we're going to talk about is osteopetrosis, and is also known as metaphyseal dysplasia or marble bone disease. Marble bone meaning that it has sort of a marbling effect when you look at it grossly. And the disorder is due to failure of osteoclasts to reabsorb bone. So what is the function of osteoclasts? Break down bone. So if they do not break down bone, what's going to happen? It's going to keep growing, and then we have accumulation of excessive amounts of bone. So osteopetrosis is where we have an accumulation of primary spongiosa in the marrow cavity. So when you look at bone, you expect to see a well-defined marrow space, and then you see the other parts of the bone adjacent to it. But with osteopetrosis, the marrow space becomes narrowed because you have excessive bony production or excessive osteoblastic activity. So when we look at it microscopically, osteoclasts are unable to absorb and shape the primary spongiosa, so you'll see very few osteoclastic cells present. So if we have an excessive amount of that, you're going to see a lot of areas where you have cartilage in the center and a lot of bony proliferation filling the marrow. So why do we have cartilage in the center? How do you think? What happens in endochondral ossification? So cartilage becomes what? And how does that happen?
Exposure to calcium.
Very good. So we have mineralization of that cartilage and it becomes hardened. And so basically we have a defective bone development. So we still have cartilage retained, some and a lot of bony proliferation in those areas. And I always like to put a picture of endochondral ossification. These are the different zones. So we have the resting zone, proliferating zone, zone of hypertrophy, and ossification, and then it becomes what we all know as trabecular bone. This is a case in a bovine of osteopetrosis. And so we have a cross-section of the bone. We have two things occurring here. So do we see any medullary cavity? It's okay to say no. There's no medullary cavity. If we do, it's probably not in this section. And so we have excessive bony proliferation. And what's the other thing that we're seeing? What is this here?
Malformation.
A malformation. Why?
If you don't have remodeling.
Very good. You must like bones.
No.
No, you don't like bones. So if we don't have remodeling and solid bone formation, that means we have cartilage, we have bone. It's sort of a mishmash of weak and semi-strong bone, because we do lose some of our calcification. We can have abnormal development of the bone and also pathologic fractures in utero. Okay? Does that make sense? So I would recommend to everyone to review endochondral ossification so you understand the different steps that's occurring. So this is the transverse section of a bone with osteopetrosis. I would expect the normal marrow space to be extended out, but we have what we see is a reduced amount of marrow space. So excessive bony proliferation, maybe some cartilage pores, and then a reduced marrow space. So that's osteopetrosis in general. Osteopetrosis can occur in Angus cattle, and we see this with a variety of congenital defects. So usually they are premature. They have brachydinasia inferior, so we talked about that. What was the other cause of that disease? BVD, yes. They'll have a protruding tongue because really due to this brachymapthus superior. The cranial vaults, so the areas in the brain are deformed and can compress the brain. Long bones are easily fractured, but not as easily as osteogenesis imperfecta, which we will talk about before the end of this hour. And there's a failure to replace woven bone with mature lamellar bone accounts for the fragility. Okay. So these are all of the different effects that we see with osteopetrosis in specific Angus cattle. So this is a congenital effect, it's autosomal recessive, and they have that in addition to the other defects. Make sure you are familiar with the defects that you can see in this. Yes, Kimberly?
So I just remembered of a disease where it happens in people. I don't know if it happens in animals. Is there a disease where, or do animals show where if they have an injury to soft tissue, it remodels back as bone? Do you know which disease I'm talking about?
There is a disease we see in the spinal column where you have soft tissue being converted into osseous metaplasia. But are you talking about like?
So like if I have a wound like in my arm, in the soft tissue area, it comes back as bone.
That sounds like.
Osteogenesis imperfecta. Does that happen in animals?
We're actually going to talk about that, but that is not a disease where soft tissue converts into bone. It's a disease where there's bony fragility. So we will talk about that in a little bit.
So maybe it's not osteogenesis. I'll look at it.
Osseous metaplasia is where you have conversion of one tissue type to bone. And for instance, people who have a lot of back problems and they have a lot of rubbing of their spinal cord, they can have areas where that tissue turns into a more of a bony proliferation. But we will talk about osteogenesis imperfecta. Any questions about this osteopetrosis? So it's usually fragile. Remember, mineralization is, we don't have that occurring as well. The next disease is porcine congenital hyperostosis. And we see this obviously in pigs. And we get them right at birth, stillborn, or they die a few days later. And it typically affects the radius and the ulnar. And what we have is a thick layer of extracortical bone. So unlike osteopetrosis where it's a defect in the osteoclast, this occurs where you just have continuous bony proliferation. So they have thickened legs, thickened limbs because we have excess bone formation in those periosteal regions. So this is a pig with congenital hyperostosis. So the back legs look fairly good, a little thickened, but if we look at the forelimbs, you can see that there's marked thickening or of the sort of the increased radius of those forelimbs. When we remove the skin and do a cross section, this would be normal, above forelimb. And below is an abnormal forelimb thickened due to periosteal bone formation. When do we see periosteal bone formation? What diseases can you think of? Yes.
This has nothing to do with us. But what are splints? Have you? Are there nothing to do with the? Yeah.
You're talking about like in your shins?
Yeah, I mean, they're like, I don't know what I'm
Actually, shin splints may be areas of periosteal bony proliferation. So that's, even though you thought it had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, this is above my pay grade, and so I'll go back to my legal work. So, okay, sorry.
I'm hoping you went back to pathology, but anyway. Anyone ever have a case of even osteosarcoma in a dog? So, even though they have, far back, they have neoplastic cells proliferate, but normal bone, periosteal bone, can also proliferate. It's sort of a defensive system for, you see it with fractures, with calluses, it's just a proliferation of the periosteum. But in this specific congenital disease, we have increased periosteal bone, and when it occurs in the porcine in utero, that's hyperostosis. So what do you think is going to happen to the surrounding soft tissue? It's going to atrophy, you may have edema, inflammation, because you're going to have pressure on those affected areas. So does everyone see it? So I always put an arrow. So we have a little excessive bone formation on the periosteum, a little bit here, but this is the real pronounced area. A little bit over here. All right, this is an H&E section, cross sections through bone, medullary cavity, right here. Right here is a medullary cavity, and this bright pink material is periosteal proliferation, or periosteal bony proliferation. Okay, thickened periosteum. So the whole point of it is we have increased bony growth. We won't spend too much time on osteochondromatosis. This is when you have cartilaginous exostosis. So this may be what you're talking about. No?
I found it.
You found, what's it called?
Fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. It is where the soft tissue injuries heal back as bone.
Bone, heal back as bone. Okay, that's good. That's good.
But
Yes, yes.
do you know if that's seen? It's not common in people, but do you know if there have been any cases in animals?
I've heard of it. I'm sure I've read articles about it. Very rare in animals. I want to say I've heard it in the cats, but yeah, yeah. Yes.
How often do you see osteochondromatosis?
Not very often. That's why we're just going to squeeze, fly by this one. So with this one, they also call it multiple cartilaginous exostosis. And it's bony proliferations in areas, specifically the mandible. A few years ago, I had a student, she said she had a dog come in, and he had this really firm mass underneath the skin, and it ended up being just a benign proliferation of bone. They're not neoplastic, but they eventually can become tumorous if they continue to grow. And this is a case where it's in the scapula. Can you imagine how painful that must have been for the animal? All right, last game before lunch. Shoot. This next person went to undergrad in Mississippi State. Who? You said J-Gon. Who? J-Gon. And served for 6 years as a volunteer firefighter. He just got more fans. I don't think I can call him J-Gon. This is Jonathan. Dr. Gun. All right. Oh, crap. Hold on a second. What? No. My pictures got messy. This is what happens.
Oh, your picture's too big.
No, I forgot to put my animation. What did you say? He said, don't show his face.
Will you put my mugshot on there when I give you mine once I get it up there?
I will put, oh my gosh, something's wrong with this picture. All right, well, I got 2 pictures. One. Why is it not?
I told y'all she was real.
Wait, what happened? I can't, it's saying that it should do now. Having technical, what did you do to my thing, Jonathan?
Jonathan?
All right, here we go. Let's pretend we didn't see it. Jonathan. Oh. Now, I've never seen you without a beard. I wasn't sure who that was. Where is this? Oh, wait a minute.
Jamaica.
In Jamaica? Was that your honeymoon? I'm all nosy.
We went to Ocho Rios.
Oh, no, that's so lovely. When did you get married? Let's just stop laughing.
May 13th of last year.
Oh, congratulations! You're newlywed. Good for you. All right, next person is from Tom Rivers, New Jersey.
Tracy.
I'm gonna stop doing where they're from.
Yeah.
Attended Delaware Valley University. Let's do it. And used to event horses and play tennis.
Yeah, no, I,
So,
she's a little.
when you say used to, that means you're no longer Tracy?
It's too expensive.
She had to put her horse on Craigslist. Oh, sorry.
Can we enjoy Tracy?
I love Tracy. She is my friend, and I would go to court for her in a second.
All right. So, you even play tennis? No?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. All right. So, I think we figured out it was Tracy. So how comes Tracy is fine and Jonathan just went cookie? I don't know what happened there. What? What's so funny?
It's because of that fake. It's the fake wife. That's what screwed up the pictures.
Oh, the fake wife. Okay. I was like, this is a cute picture. Who's this baby, Tracy? Nesty? Who? Nestle?
Like the Loch Ness Monster.
Nettie. I got it. I'm just laughing. Oh, Lordy. Alright. You cut your hair in this picture. That was last year? Okay. Alright. I'm not even going to ask you about who gentleman in the picture, but we keep moving. Next. I'm nosy. Alright, last. And let me ask you, let me just make a point. When I go on your Facebook page, I am not snooping. I just want cute pictures and I go about my business because I don't have the time. Okay?
Have you been on my, are you on Facebook?
I am on Facebook. I mean, I retire here and there when people get on my nerves, but
You don't have any of my pictures, I know, do you?
well, who knows? The last person is from Columbia, Maryland, which I'm not sure what this is, but I want to know. Picture. Attended Tuskegee University, my alma mater, and has scaled down a castle in Assisi, Italy. Good grief. I'm sure it's not this one. Can anybody guess who this is? Shannon. Italy, really? Cool. I'm not doing that. So I couldn't find your picture, but I stole it from somebody else.
That's cute.
Yes. Alright, daggone it. I hate when I don't find pictures, so. Yeah. Christina, you would say it. I just realized who said that. It is cute. That is a cute picture, though. Yes. Her hair looks fabulous. Alright. One more person. It's from from Texas. Attended Texas State University. Texas State. And why would the fiber get tools out of metal? You're a metal person? What is that called?
A blacksmith?
Oh, you're a blacksmith? That's even better. I just
That was
don't know.
welding right there.
Here you go. So can anybody guess who this is? Victor.
She shoved down his Cowboys t-shirt real quick.
Cute. Now this one had me rolling in my office. Do you see the look on that pig's face? It's like, oh my God, where am I going? Okay. Where were you taking this pig?
He's still out of the crates.
look like life is ending. Anyway. Alright. Speaking of osteogenesis imperfecta, so this is an osteopenic disease. So what does osteopenia mean?
Loss of bone density.
Yes, loss of bone density. And so if we have loss of bone density, we're going to have increased fragility of bone and joints laxity. So it's caused by a defect in your osteoblastic production of type 1 collagen. So this is important to know. I usually don't ask genetic defects, but it's important to realize why we have this. So we see thin cortices and wide narrow spaces. So you have osteopenia, loss of bone. In utero, these individuals come out with a lot of calluses. And why is that? What does osteopenia lead to? If you have thin bone, what's going to fracture? You're going to get a fracture and then a secondary callus will form. Most calves, and they can be stillborn, and usually they have some other congenital defects that can usually lead to their death. So this has occurred in people. Has anybody ever seen this really bad movie? I'm sorry, I thought it was horrible. I'm just like, can't. Who thought it was a good movie? Okay, who's actually seen the movie? 4 people. Okay.
It's part of the Marvel universe.
Okay. So if you've seen this movie, what are the characters? Who is Samuel L. Jackson?
He has brittle bones.
He has brittle bones, so he actually had osteogenesis imperfecta. And he was a miserable so-and-so, but